Joke around some more. Just throw your coat on the fire and get yourself out on the wall. Just throw your coat on the fire and get yourself.
How are you feeling? How are you doing with all this? Are you safe?
Lord only knows. I think I'm safe. I mean, I've always watched my back in my life, given my upbringing and things of that nature, but I suppose I might watch it a little more closely, in the evenings and things when I'm on campus. But the class has been going on as I expected it would go on. It's been a pleasant experience and an engaging experience for the students. They're participating. A lot of great conversations are happening. I don't feel that these folks are going to try to put their threats into action, because I think at the end of the day, they're basically cowards. I can't be bothered with that, really, so I really I can't change up what I do because of these folks, because that would disrupt my kind of way of life, and I'm not going to allow them to do that. And when it's my time to go, it's my time to go. I'm not trying to go tomorrow, or today. It is what it is.
Same way, maybe it's my working class roots with my parents, my father, and the men around me and others raised me. It's like, you got to have certain principles. And you got to stand on those principles. And what will happen will happen. You can't live a life of fear. You can't live as a coward. You can't go into hiding. You simply got to walk the walk. And if you believe it, you got to believe it.
That's right. Got to maintain my racial integrity.
Mm-hmm. With what's going on nationally, again, this is not coincidence. There is a vast right-wing apparatus that's been in existence for years online and elsewhere to track, harass, and monitor educators. They could be college, high school, postgraduate. The right wing, the Koch brothers funded types do not like. The Fox News types find dangerous. So, how did this all happen? I mean, if we were going to cast the screenplay, or are you going to come up with a book about your experience? What would be the story?
Well, I've been teaching courses on racial stratification for about a decade. And when it was time to come up with my list of classes that I would teach in the spring, I knew I wanted to teach racial stratification course like I always do. And this is my third year at Florida Gulf Coast University. And I hadn't yet taught a racial stratification course or race theory course. I taught one called Race and Law Enforcement and the Sociology of African Americans. So I wanted to kind of freestanding racial stratification course. And so I just thought of a title that would capture the essence of what I wanted to teach. And I thought that the term white racism was an appropriate one. I knew that some white folks would get upset by it, but I can't concern myself with them. We looking to engage students, pique their interest on the course schedule, the course catalog. And so I wanted them to, be excited to take the course, the students who weren't aware of it, who I hadn't had before. And that's what happened. The reason why things have gotten out of control with regard to my class is because some of these student Republican groups and libertarian groups online and went on the Facebook and tagged me and mentioned some stuff and how it was racist against white folks and stuff like that. And then they tagged Fox News and a local NBC affiliate. And then it kind of picked up from there. Then several of these reactionary media outlets picked the story up around October, end of October, early November. And that's when it all began.
That's how the machine works, right? They get you on social media. They reach up to their allies, the Fox News and elsewhere, the Ann Coulters, the Milos or Milos, everyone to pronounce that character's names. The Bill O'Reillys of the world, the Tucker Carlson, who's been after me to come on his show, and I've said no. And they want to create this outrage. The thinking on one hand is so simple and binary, but the machine is remarkably effective in terms of dealing with these hyper-emotional, anti-intellectual, low-information types who, frankly, are racists. They're white supremacists, for all intents and purposes. We can, define terms. And then they come at folks and they try to ruin them. But I mean, was it a surprise? Like, literally, were you walking around one day and then you started getting all these emails or people calling you? How did it happen?
That Tucker Carlson character, his producers tried to get me on there 4 separate times, and I've ignored them each time. Yeah, so I first got contacted by the local media here, the TV networks in town here, and then the local paper. And then they covered the story and interviewed some students on campus and asked me about it. And I think what kind of had these racist conservative folks go apoplectic was the fact that I would not apologize or say that, maybe I should have moderated my tone or the title. And so I didn't cede any ground to them. And so I think they took offense by that, and then they got even more upset. But I don't have nothing to concede. I've said before, if you're not a white racist, then you shouldn't be concerned with the title.
Thinking about Brother George Yancey, philosopher, his work, I'm sure you're familiar with, the idea of white racial logic. But in terms of trying to understand the white racial logic at work, capital W white, with these white conservatives and others, because it's not just white ones, because again, they're enabled by black and brown conservatives as well. They're some of the most lethal and aggressive attack dogs for them. What is their logic at work in terms of saying you should apologize or that the class is racist? Sort of, cognitive map are they operating from?
I mean, everything for these folks is predicated on the post-racial nature of our society. They all think that we've kind of eclipsed the point where race matters, except in some exceptional cases where people are wearing the hoods and the robes, then in those instances.
Or where white people are quote unquote oppressed, reverse racism and other foolishness.
They do believe that. They believe the pendulum has swung so far in the other direction now that they're being oppressed, right? And when we talk about institutional racism, some folks have asked me, like, why didn't you just title it institutional racism and things? They actually believe that institutional racism affects them. They think affirmative action is actually an instantiation of institutional racism negatively affecting the life chances of whites. So I actually think that these folks are delusional. It's either they're delusional or they're indifferent, or I've been trying to work with this new concept of white sadism. I think that they derive, it has that kind of sexual connotation to it. And for some, I think it might very well be the case. That's how it has been historically. It had the sexual element, but even irrespective or independent of the sexual element, just the fact that these folks are allowing this kind of system to oppress millions of folks up to this current moment, they've got to derive some kind of pleasure in doing so. And so I think that we got to move beyond even what I just said, indifference, I don't care. But when you know the data and the data is screaming at you, and if the data is not screaming at you, the empirical data, the history should be screaming at you, even though they've tried to erase the history from the textbooks the students are exposed to in schools. They know, everybody knows, these white folks know what the history of this country is.
I absolutely fundamentally agree with you. I mean, logic there at work in terms of fascism, racial authoritarianism, political sadism or sadopolitic. And the other angle here, too, is literally thinking about, in this country, we don't have a sophisticated enough public discourse about the realities of racism and white supremacy for a variety of reasons. And a fundamental truth about racism, again, as a system of power, is its violence. It's institutional structural violence and it's interpersonal violence. It's also about punishing black and brown bodies. So when you have a black or brown educator who is free within certain limitations, who's intellectually competent, who's emotionally competent, who's not going to be a coward, who dares to say no, well, that's defying their version or understanding of the white gaze, because black and brown folks are supposed to get off the sidewalk. We're supposed to be submissive. And how dare you talk about the realities of racism in this country? Another theme here that in terms of encountering folks who've gone through these struggles, literally when Trumpism comes raining down on individuals in higher education and elsewhere, is how is the administration? Because I've heard some stories where you have administrators basically firing people or putting them on indefinite leave by saying, well, it's too dangerous for you to be here. So for your own safety, you need to leave, or care about you. We want to protect you. So why don't you take a leave of absence? Or just saying, why don't you apologize?
So I've been pleasantly surprised by the strong support I've received from the president of the institution, because, it's certainly the case that faculty members who are under assault by these right-wing folks are often thrown under the bus, and or they release these kind of weak, tepid, pablum-like statements trying to reaffirm their commitments to those terms like diversity and inclusivity and tolerance and multiculturalism, all that kind of stuff. So I've been pleasantly surprised. This is a white man, but apparently he's been a member of the NAACP for 30 to 35 years. So he has a history of being associated and a member of a group. So he has at least some understanding of the realities of these issues. I mean, I think he's doing the right thing. That's what he's supposed to do. I'm pleased that he's doing it and respecting and protecting my academic freedom. So there have been some folks, at the institution within the kind of power structure, let's say, who have not been antagonistic, but they've been a bit reticent about the title. I mean, could racism in contemporary America work? Or how about just institutional or systemic racism? Would that be an appropriate term? And my answer is no, that wouldn't be appropriate, because it wouldn't be candid, it wouldn't be honest, and it's not correct. So I can't name it that. So I have no intention of ever changing the title. That would only happen if they terminate me or if they change it themselves, but then I'll make sure to communicate the fact that I had nothing to do with it.
So you mentioned these Republicans. They're monitoring your classes, they're recording folks, they're trying to get people fired. Just in terms of the campus climate, what other antics has that group of students been up to? Were you anticipating this? I mean, have they been very active, have a pattern of harassing people at your campus or your institution?
Well, I don't know how familiar you are with it, but over the last several years, we've had a number of instances of white racist terrorist threats on campus, those anonymous kind. that come in the dead of night where they write things on the whiteboards in public spaces, in the library, in certain academic buildings. There was one that said something about kill niggers or kill all the niggers or something like that with a hangman image. They plastered a place where it's okay to be white posters. So there's been a number of these instances, and there was a large protest on campus in reaction to previous presidents' administration's failure to communicate that one of these events had occurred for a 2-week period. We were irate that we didn't know about that. That creates an unsafe situation for us, and we don't even know that it's happening. So we don't know who wrote those things. Apparently, if you look in the news, the person that put some of those flyers up recently, those "It's okay to be white" flyers, he admitted doing it, and I think he got sanctioned by the institution. He said he was trying to communicate something. I don't know what he's trying to communicate, but are they active? I mean, I think they are. There's different elements. That Turning Point USA group, I think that they're on campus. I've seen them on campus before. And I remember a year or so ago, they had one of their kind of regional recruiters, maybe a 25, 30-year-old guy that was working with the younger students to get their chapter going. These kind of groups are present here. And this is a very red, like blood red area around here, Southwest Florida. Rick Scott got one of his mansions down here. And we got this Congressman Rooney, I think his name is. And these are some far-right people over here.
Thinking just about the history of Florida, I mean, Florida per capita had more lynchings than any other state in the country. Trying to understand these folks' intellectual maps, so again, trying to work with white racial logic. Why is the very statement of the fact of white racism so provocative? Because white racism is one of the most, obviously, it defines modernity for all intents and purposes. It's one of the most important or powerful forces in all of history. Why is the statement in the language itself so provocative? What are they upset about?
It's predicated on their way of producing these kind of false equivalencies. They believe that racism, first of all, is not a structural phenomenon. It's something that is limited to the ideational level, thoughts and beliefs and attitudes. And so by me titling the course White Racism, I'm being very blunt and making a claim that you, white folks, and your ancestors and your white-controlled institutions are responsible for the gross differences in social outcomes between whites and folks of color. And that's just too direct for them to stomach. They don't agree with it. The one thing I've learned thus far about this whole experience, one of the most salient things that I've learned, is that we've had these courses called systemic racism and race and class in American culture and race and ethnic relations in sociology for a long time, and some other disciplines. It must be the case that these individuals were going around thinking that those courses were not focused on systemic racism, and they were simply focusing on this kind of idea that we're all racially prejudiced, you're bad, I'm bad, we should all just be kind to one another and the world will be a better place. And so I didn't realize how deeply they believed that, because they're not attacking all these other courses with those other titles. They're going after folks, particularly with regard to courses on race. They're going after courses, abolition of whiteness, problem of whiteness, white racism, these courses. But all the people I know that are sociologists that teach race are teaching the same material. There's a body of scholarship, and we're teaching the same type of thing.
Making the invisible for them, it's hypervisible for black and brown folks and for some white brothers and sisters who've done the work. Making whiteness visible is inherently a threat because, again, one of the ways that white privilege works is through normality, privilege, and visibility. It's a type of property, a type of privilege. It's social dominance behavior. In practice, very often, historically, it's violence. So when you name this thing that they take to be normal and unmarked, and it just, quote unquote, means to be an American, and that's why I laugh when they talk about other folks being, fragile and being hypersensitive, that they simply can't handle it. To actually name a thing for what it is simply too disruptive to them emotionally and psychologically.
I think that is the case. You got to be able to name something before you can fight it. So, and they know that because these folks, despite the fact that think they are incorrect on understanding racial matters, they do still have some brain cells operating. And so they're sophisticated enough, let's say, to know that by naming these courses and outing whiteness in these kinds of ways, there's a possibility there for other folks to be persuaded by the empirical evidence that attests to the continuing significance of race and racism. So they know that. And so that's why they have to use these kinds of guerrilla-style tactics, these right-wing guerrilla-style tactics, to try to shut us down.
Because I could imagine, you probably got emails like this or some folks saying in the faculty lounge or at home reading about this, what sort of white person would take a course called white racism? Some sort of self-flagellating, guilty white liberal. What's the profile there? And are there some white conservative students who are in the class who've taken that out of curiosity or to be disruptive?
I don't think they got the fortitude, those kind of folks, to take the class. It would be good for them to take it. I'm open to them taking it.
Sick people need to go to the hospital and get well and get medicine.
Right. If they're in there, they've been discreet enough to not let me know it. I would say the demographics of the class, there's approximately 50 students. I think that, well, clearly the majority are Black and brown. The majority are Latinos and Black students from different ethnic backgrounds. There's probably about, let's say, 8 to 10 white students enrolled in the class. Most of them, to the extent that I know them, they seem to have a generally data-informed, kind of correct, sophisticated understanding of the basics, the nature of race in this country.
Now, I don't want you to laugh. So I'm going to throw you a softball because I think it's a productive question. Because again, thinking about sort of the lie of post-racial America, the lie of colorblind racism, et cetera, or the reality of colorblind racism, one of the common deflections I'm sure you heard from the Fox News types, the white conservatives who are trying to drum you up, folks threatening you, is the way to get past racism is not to talk about it and that you're causing trouble. So how would you rebut that very 101 level right-wing, even some liberals, sort of intervention about these conversations, that the way to get past racism is to stop talking about it?
Yeah, like where?
Don't fall out in laughter. I know.
I wrote an essay on that. Where do you begin? You can't address a problem without talking about it. There are processes and practices and laws and traditions and customs that have been in place for generations that have persisted and that the negative effects continue to this day. So by refusing to talk about race and racism, or even to collect data, some folks have gone so far, I'm sure you're familiar with, we shouldn't even collect the data on it. We don't even need to put the questions in the surveys or anything anymore, even at the federal or state level, just completely eliminate it, as though that by itself would enable race problems to go away. We definitely need to continue to talk about it. And it's those people's sentiment that are communicating that are the problem. It's you even saying what's coming out of your mouth that's the problem. The fact that these individuals would have the kind of the audacity and the temerity or the arrogance to think that other folks should silence themselves and not communicate about the problems we have.
What is the most difficult concept for students in general to sort of understand about social dynamics or about race or about the color line? I mean, what are some of the one or two things that keep coming back? For experts, it's like, okay, we understand this.
The one that just seems so kind of basic to folks like you and me is the concept of white supremacy. Whenever I try to communicate that to folks, they immediately go to like the Klan and the neo-Nazis and the skinheads. And it's so clear to me that we have this kind of structural system in place and all of these elements of the system work together, that there's a logic to it, that white supremacy has permeated all aspects of society within formal organizations, within the minds of people, within the belief systems, ideologies that circulate among us. It seems so clear, but it's really hard for people to see that because they just don't see it, particularly white students. They just don't see it. So they're like, how are you saying that there's a system in place? We have laws that say you can't discriminate. And I responded, and we also have laws that say you can't drive over the speed limit and pull that phone out and text people while you're driving and things of that nature, but it still happens. So I think it's hard for them to understand the kind of structural systemic nature of racism. Even when I say and I show them the data, it's just really hard for a lot of white students and some confused students of color. That's the one that I seem to have difficult conveying to them.
Is it just a belief in sort of these lies about American exceptionalism and sort of a type of projection at work where if you were going to talk in a serious way about white supremacy as a concept, as a theory, as again, it's not even debatable. I mean, the overwhelming empirical evidence that this is the society in which we live in terms of overdetermining life chances, that it's a projection on their goodness? Because I encounter that a lot. Folks, no. They have a caricature of the Klan and Nazis, but they don't want to look in the mirror and ask themselves, how are they reproducing these power relationships? How do they benefit from the system? Because then, oh my God, then they got to ask hard questions about their own human decency and morality and behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. For some of them, that is the problem. It calls into question, like you said, am I a good person? Am I a good white person? Am I good? And you might be good, but good people can be complicit too. And that's the part that they don't like. They just don't like the idea that they could be complicit in the system when they don't believe they have any animus in their heart. And so they don't see how they can be contributing to the maintenance of white supremacy. Another concept that's difficult for them, and it's connected to that one, is this concept of meritocracy. When I try to communicate to them that this whole idea of meritocracy is a myth, they get stupefied and What do you mean? Like, people achieve things because they worked hard for it. And that's connected, because they just simply can't fathom that we have a system where people work hard and don't make it.
Do they ponder the absurdity of saying that to someone who's presumably, person of color, black man, whose descendants were owned as human labor in America?
I think we give some folks too much credit. I don't want to make a blanket statement about undergraduate students in general, because the student populations vary across and within institutions. So, and where I teach now, I have a whole range of students, from students who could be at any institution in this country, and then students that might not want to be at any of them. So, but the ones that I'm talking to you about that could be anywhere, they don't say crazy stuff like that. I think some folks, students don't read anymore, and they don't think as much either.
Not just them. I mean, that's adults. Think about this last election. Folks are throwing a fit about Russian interference, which was substantial, and using bots and using these sock puppets online. And I'm like, this is an indictment of stupid people. That if you actually believe the stuff you read and don't do your own research, and just because it shows up on a screen, this is an indictment of intelligence, our civic culture, civic literacy, and the American people's attention span and wisdom.
Everything we've been discussing, a great deal of it can be attributed to the kind of poor and problematic K through 12 education that students get across this country. But there are so many people from the far right that are trying to take certain types of books and materials out of classrooms. I mean, we have a law in Florida that was passed recently. I don't know if it was the county or the state of Florida, where anybody can question the materials that our students are reading in K through 12 in Florida, or at least in our county here. And so just random people can call them into question, which requires a group of people to weigh in on it and decide whether it's appropriate for them to be reading. And I'm not even talking about provocative stuff. They just might not like the idea that the topic in general is being covered. As benignly as it might be covered, and as gently and age appropriately as it might be covered, they just don't like it. It's about defunding. It's even in higher education, where philosophy programs, anthropology programs, sociology programs are questioned because students getting jobs in them.
Because you're teaching people to think, and you're teaching them to be citizens, but they want to make them drones for STEM fields in the neoliberal order. They don't want critical thinkers.
That's really what it comes down to, because when people think, when people think and they get the data, there's only but so many conclusions you can draw. And you can't draw the ones that these other folks want them to draw once they are exposed to the data and they've been taught true history of this country. It makes it much more difficult to hold on to these kind of delusional understandings of the past and the present.
A syllabus is a story, right? The literature you include, the literature you don't include, the narrative, the concepts we have to hit, the classic that always going to be included. So when you're putting together the syllabus for this course on white racism, what was the general outline? And what are some of the high points?
First of all, in all my syllabi, I have an introduction that's more extended than a course description. And so it typically might be a few paragraphs. In there, I kind of lay out this narrative, which is the origin of this country and vis-a-vis race, and that this is a white supremacist society. So that's like axiomatic. And we're not going to debate about whether this nation's history actually happened or not. So I just don't go there. Then the first week of class for this type of course, we talk about the race concept itself, discuss this kind of myth of biological race, and then introduce students to the basic and essential piece that is race as a social construction, that it's a political, social, and cultural idea, so that it's not biologically real, but it's real in its social consequences. And then once we've established that, we move on to discussing different sociological theories of racism, different racial ideologies, and then we proceed into different social institutions and the ways in which white racism manifests itself across social institutions. And so students have been looking at the media and popular culture, the education system. We will look at government, the economy, the labor market, housing, as well as we've even talked about concepts like colorism, but not simply colorism as understood typically just solely as this kind of invidious thing that exists within certain communities of color, but that it's also a product of global white supremacy, and that there's a phenomenon called white colorism, and that white people also engage in this process. So it's not simply something that Black folks, for example, are engaging in within the Black community, but it's also white folks are also engaging in that as well. So we talk about that too. And then at the end of the semester, we have time to actually discuss some kind of strategies that we've not already thought about, but kind of imagining ways that students and just individuals in general can push back, challenge white supremacy and white racism at an interpersonal level in individuals' own personal lives and kind of conversations with family and friends and peers, but also how we might engage as political actors in unison to kind of decapitate this kind of multi-headed white racist monster.
What's your favorite week to teach or subject matter?
I get really excited about talking about colorblind ideology and how pervasive it is and the effects it has on people, because I think that's kind of the primary operating logic of everything else that flows contemporarily. So I get excited about communicating to students that despite the fact that we have this kind of resurgence of these overtly white racist hate groups and them trying to blanket themselves in acceptable kind of presentation, that's not actually the principal mechanism through which folks of color have their life chances constrained, limited, truncated, and reduced. But it's actually these kinds of seemingly non-racial processes and practices and traditions. And they're engaged in by not only people that are conservative, but also well-meaning, tender-hearted white liberals also reproduce these practices. And so I get really excited about talking about the hegemony of colorblind ideology and post-raciality. That's kind of the overarching thing, I would say, concept that I'm trying to communicate to them, theme I want them to get. Because I think that that's a primary tool for seeing deeper into their personal relationships and better understanding their kind of existence within different institutional settings, when they're on the job, when they're on the sports field and they see how things work, when they engage on social media. Just understanding colorblind ideology as a backdrop will help them interpret and make sense and analyze different social situations in a more accurate manner.
If someone were to ask you, given your expertise and experience, and there's no right or wrong answer, as I said, take it as you may, how was Donald Trump able to get elected? How would you answer that question?
A lot of folks have talked about the resentment of the white working class. I think there's a confluence of factors that have come together to elevate this man in this manner and bring him to the White House. Part of it is white working class resentment is one element of it. I think another element of it that I think too many people haven't spoken about is that I think people on the left thought that it was so inevitable that Hillary would win. They didn't go to the polls. People didn't go to the polls. So there's certainly this element of the white working class being resentful, that the Mexicans are coming to take their jobs and Muslims are coming and taking over, and we're going to have Sharia law all over the country, and that the gains of the civil rights movement have gone too far, and the opportunities for the everyday white working Joe and Jane have gone away. They can't make it. I think that was part of it. And I think another part of it is, I don't know if the right word is apathy, but a kind of just a sense that this can't happen, that this man, clearly people are too intelligent to vote for this man. I was flabbergasted myself when he got elected, and it was surreal experience in the middle of the night seeing that. I don't think there's some kind of deep kind of understanding about how could it happen? This is a really racist country. These folks voted for him because they thought that he would work for them and make their lives better. He felt the pulse, or had people advising him that had the pulse of these groups. He spoke in a kind of way that was attractive to them. And these kinds of, it wasn't really a code. It was just straight up like they would talk in their everyday lives, and they thought he was just like them and forgot the fact that this guy was a billionaire and has nothing to do with them. It has no relationship to them except that they look, their skin color is the same. And I think that's the basis of it.
As my mother said, he wouldn't pee on them if they were on fire. Literally, they wouldn't. And that's, again, the psychological wages of whiteness. You don't need to read Brother W.E.B. Du Bois to understand that. They voted for him because he's an avatar of whiteness and an avatar of bigotry and violence and misogyny, and he's who they want to be. He's their hero. Given everything that's happened, what are you hopeful for in America's future, and what are you deeply concerned about?
It's a tough one for me because I'm a fairly cynical person. So,
well, tell some truth.
I'm a follower of the late Derek Bell's work, and so I'm not particularly hopeful with regard to racial progress in our lifetime. I think things can get better than they are now, but the kind of problems we have can change it, but it'll be a matter of degree. I think racial contestation will persist, perhaps during this kind of demographic transition that the census is forecasting, that in the wake of that, some coalitions could be formed among communities of color that are sometimes at odds and anti-racist whites. That's a possibility, but I don't see that happening for decades and decades. The one thing on a personal level that kind of encouraged me, since I'm so negative and pessimistic, generally speaking, is the kind of positive response I got from people via email after all this went down, and it was reported that I was getting all these threats and hate mail. I got a lot of positive emails of encouragement and support from, probably a couple hundred people from all over the country and some outside of the US. And so that kind of hit me in a way emotionally that I don't usually get touched. And so that there has required me or encouraged me or prompted me to perhaps temper some of my pessimism, but it's still in my cynicism, but it's still there. Maybe there's a little bit of hope for me if I see some kind of changes. Maybe the 2018 election will give me a little bit of hope. I have this dream that a lot of people in my position, probably a pipe dream, but the Democrats take both houses of Congress, and then we impeach this racist clown, and then Pence is impeached too. The Speaker of the House will be a Democrat, and then we'll at least have an opportunity to get some kind of progress in some more positive directions. That's about the best hope that I have right now.
I want to thank Brother Dr. Professor Ted Thornhill for that great teaching and sharing. As I said, I'm so blessed to have an opportunity to speak with brothers and sisters, lions, even though they are humble in their strength, such as Dr. Thornhill and so many others. And I can do that because of all of you. That's why I thank you every episode. Thank all of you. Some people may listen and say, why is he thanking everybody? Makes him sound low rent, like he doesn't think folks will listen. No, I have gratitude. Gratitude for all of you.